This is a reading of Athonite Flowers by Monk Moses of Mount Athos. Athonite Flowers, 7 contemporary essays on the spiritual life, translated and edited by Father Stephen Chamberas. Chapter 1. The Community of the Desert and the Loneliness of the Cities. Toward the end of the 18th century, St. Cosmas Aitolos foretold that a time would come when a person would have to travel for days to meet another person whom he could embrace as a brother. We are living in an age where this is already happening. Contemporary man, in his loneliness, experiences pathological anxiety, anguish, and suffering. He is tormented and, in turn, torments others. Why? This essay will attempt an answer by bringing the fragrance of community found in the desert to the loneliness and the desolation found in cities. Contemporary loneliness. Loneliness is the absence of communication and relationship, the inability to develop and maintain associations with others. Contemporary culture and the structures of society, the mass media reflecting prevailing ideologies, even children's games, lead to social alienation, political estrangement, and personal isolation. The individual person begins, early on, to be possessed by an overwhelming feeling of inadequacy, to lose the meaning and purpose of life, to live without principles and discipline, to be constantly suspicious and in doubt. Alone and insecure, anxious and disorderly, modern man, and particularly the contemporary young person, attempts to build bridges, to raise flags, to shout slogans. But without a guide, or with bad guides, he is readily disillusioned and becomes hard and aggressive, a plaything for political exploiters and power-hungry anarchists. The desire for freedom becomes the bitter death of his freedom. The young, who earlier had declared that they would never compromise with anyone, are now themselves compromised. They take refuge in demonstrations and sit-ins, becoming rebellious in an effort to relieve themselves of the weight of their loneliness, not realizing that they are thrusting themselves into an even more unbearable slavery. It is particularly unfortunate that all this is happening where least expected, even with young people of good education, exceptional intelligence, energy, and talent. Unsatisfied with material prosperity and disillusioned by the hypocrisy of their elders, these young people struggle for simpler life, for quality in life, for a better way of life, but unfortunately they do not manage to make the right beginning. Modern art is a good example of the spiritual alienation that we see. Instead of shedding light and opening windows toward others and toward heaven, it tends to shut us in and to plunge us ever deeper into obscurity and darkness. It is not long before isolated man begins to talk to himself, to the irrational animals, to the shadows that surround him, and to the dead. By now, he is seriously sick. Melancholy, phobias, suspicion, and mistrust have made him a psychopath. A most appropriate observation characterizes our time as the century of the psychiatrist. According to the World Health Organization statistics for 1985, there are more than 400 million people in the world suffering from deep depression, with about 400,000 committing suicide each year. And these statistics refer only to the developed countries. In his isolation, man is plagued relentlessly by egotism and pride, which are the natural parents of his loneliness. Humility, an antidote to loneliness. If egotism and pride foster this kind of loneliness, then true humility, even though the term is misused and loses meaning among those who merely talk about it, produces the climate in which this loneliness is not permitted to thrive. Behold how the desert, that good mother, excellent philosopher and theologian, speaks about holy humility, silence, and peace. The humble person, according to Abba Poimen, is comfortable and at peace wherever he may find himself. Abba Isaac tells us that he who makes himself small in everything will be exalted above all. And his discerning voice continues, "Hate honor, and you will be honored indeed. He who runs after honors causes honor itself to be banished from him. But if you merely disdain yourself hypocritically in order to appear humble, God will reveal you." End quote. In the Gerontikon, which contains a wide variety of spiritual writings from the Fathers, it is repeatedly made clear that, quote, "the humble-minded and lowly in heart is not the one who cheapens himself and talks about humility, but the one who endures joyfully the dishonors which come from his neighbor." End quote. In another place, the Gerontikon states, quote, "the person honored more than he deserves is actually harmed, while the person who is not honored at all by his fellow human beings will be honored in heaven by God." End quote. Abba Poimen gives us this advice: "Every possible sorrow that comes to you can be overcome with silence." End quote. Abba Isaiah agrees with him, quote, "Until your heart is at peace through prayer, make no effort to explain anything to your brother." End quote. In studying the writings of the Holy Fathers of the Desert, one can easily observe a common mind, a common noble spirit, a humaneness, an understanding, a wisdom. There are dewdrops of the Holy Spirit which fall in the arid desert after long struggles, which make fragrant flowers grow among the communities of faithful committed totally to God, and which make fragrant the souls of those who truly thirst for God. Abba Isaiah, that great mind, notes with particular grace and subtlety, quote, "He who humbles himself before God is capable of enduring every insult. The humble person is not concerned about what others say about him. The person who bears the harsh word of a rude and foolish man for the sake of God is worthy of acquiring peace." End quote. Abba Mark, on this important topic, our relationship with ourselves and with others, in which we find ourselves stumbling on a daily basis, goes on to note the following, quote, "When you become aware of the thought in your mind dictating human glory, you should know for sure that this thought is preparing you for shame. And if you discern someone praising you hypocritically, expect also his accusation sometime soon." End quote. And with the daring precision of a surgeon of the soul, the Holy Abba continues, quote, "When you see someone crying over the many insults he has received, you should know that because he was overcome by vainglory, he is now unknowingly reaping the crop of evils in his heart. He who loves pleasure is grieved by accusations and abuse. On the other hand, he who loves God is grieved by praises and other superfluous remarks. The degree of our humility is measured by slander. Don't think that you have humility when you cannot forbear even the slightest accusation." End quote. Abba Zosima goes even further, quote, "Remember the one who has ridiculed you, who has grieved you, who has wronged you, who has done evil to you, as your physician, your healer. Christ sent him to heal you. Don't remember him with anger." End quote. Evagrios considered those who spoke badly of him as benefactors. The divine wisdom of these physicians of the desert has tremendous significance to our topic. It has been said that these remarks are addressed by monks and for monks, but this is a superficial view. The epidemic of loneliness and depression that we are discussing results from proud minds lacking in humility, from failed interpersonal relationships, from unsatisfied egotistical aspirations, from self-aggrandizement, praise-seeking, and self-love. This loneliness is strong enough to weaken a person and to make him sick. But love is stronger, capable of healing and regenerating the whole world. Man has an irrepressible need to communicate, but communication must be properly developed. Initially, we must strike up a conversation, a sincere, honorable, and courageous conversation with our unknown self. We must rediscover in the very depths of our soul the hidden innocence of our childhood years. Next, we must learn to have unmasked, face-to-face conversation with the only true living friend, our Heavenly Father and God. Only then will we be able to effectively communicate with others, whoever they are, the worst, the best, the neighbors, the distant, our brothers and sisters in Christ. In this manner, the webs of loneliness are removed, the inaccessible and sunless dungeons of the heart are illumined, the shell of our ego is broken. When we have rejected the loneliness of miserable, self-centered egotism, we can begin to rejoice, to be free, to breathe, to live. Natural loneliness, a sanctuary of knowledge, of self, and of God. There is another type of loneliness, natural loneliness, which is not pathological but creative, life-giving, full of grace. It is exemplified by the natural separation of monastics from the world. It is a loneliness to which we all should devote much time. We must be able to withdraw ourselves from the noisy crowds which are so superficial, so distracting, and so counterproductive, in a withdrawal which is healthy, beautiful, and good. It is important that we learn to shut off the constant communication with the many, which does not allow us to be alone with ourselves, and as a consequence we are not able to be with the one who is always waiting, the incarnate Logos and God. We must make the time and find the way for this other kind of sacred communication of natural loneliness. And we must pursue this knowledgeably with an orderly, disciplined program. Please keep in mind that we are not talking about those who seek to escape from preoccupations with the world in order to find rest, to view beautiful sunsets, to gaze at star-studded skies. Such activities are not spiritual. Neither are we talking about those who seek to meditate using techniques of doubtful origins to achieve dubious results. Nor are we discussing those who devote fleeting moments to superficial daydreams and who presume to have repented when they feel sentimental emotions as they remember indiscretions of their past. And we certainly are not talking about the well-meaning but naive who think the spiritual life of sacred quietude consists of strolling at the seashore with prayer beads in hand. Furthermore, we are not referring to the spiritual tourists who visit the holy places and converse boldly with holy persons, but who do not deny their ego nor sacrifice their will. Activities such as these are only superficial attempts to escape from life, through shallow daydreaming and capricious imagination. What we are talking about is sacred quietude, achieved with ascetic effort, which liberates us from the loneliness of the world, even though we find ourselves in a noisy city or a disorderly household. We are talking about the persistence and the patience which help us probe the deepest roots of our existence and understand its limits, and which dispel the darkness that tires and discourages us. We need to learn to pray. We need vigils, constant vigilance in a posture of immobility and calmness. When I am near God, what do I have to fear? He has guided me to where I may be guided by him. Despairing of friends and of acquaintances, sorely disappointed with the arts, the technologies, the ideologies, disenchanted with social chatter and vacuous etiquette, I come to the privilege of ultimate despair. I become aware that in my nakedness, God himself is there to vest me with authentic hope. And in this miracle, the blessed Panagia and all the saints are present to lend their support. In this natural loneliness, this divine loneliness, I find relief. The actor's masks which I had felt obliged to put on, or which had been put on me, have been discarded. It had been a dreadful state. Every night I needed to go to another gathering to be part of another group, for I had to be included somewhere. I was constantly changing my mask. Now, however, by turning inward, I begin to live, to become aware that I am a child of God, to unveil my unique and irreplaceable identity, my face, my person. I begin to observe the activities of the passions. I can see my strengths and my limitations. I am redeemed from errors, fantasies, excesses, and languid apathy. A firm resolve helps guide our steps to this lonely sanctuary of knowledge, of self and of God. In this sanctuary, the loneliness, the aloneness, which had been feared, becomes a delight. For the person who is with God can never be alone, since he is in dialogue with himself and with God. Here we find ourselves with less individualism and greater love for others. We find tears for the pain and suffering of our brothers, and strength for greater efforts that will help them. For the voice which arises from the depths of the lone person cuts through the clouds and reaches the triune God, who always listens and always responds. The divine loneliness of man in communion with God. The man in communion with God knows how to make his voice more fervent and to rejoice while standing in second place. He knows how to be a friend even with the stranger and to be satisfied with little. Moreover, he knows how to become tired in his diligent efforts and how to wash with tears those who are grasping and prodigal. And he knows how to do these things without complaint or dissatisfaction, even if abandoned by relatives, friends, colleagues. Far from the tumultuous crowds and the confusion of the public arena, in the privacy of your room, choose freely and without coercion. It may appear that you are not offering anything to others and that you are being self-centered, particularly when others are saying that they need you, as they suffer from painful loneliness. This loneliness, which you have chosen for yourself, is an arduous task, requiring great strength, heroism, persistence. It is a long and endless undertaking, and sometimes it can be a preparation for a return to those whom you have left out of your life, although this should never be the purpose of your ascetic commitment. All the saints of our church, the most fervent and active missionaries, even the Lord himself in his earthly life, experienced the mystery of divine loneliness. Remember those great personalities, the prophets of the Old Testament, Moses, Elijah, Isaiah, and John the Forerunner. Returning to our century, we find it tragically alone, in despair, pessimistic. In spite of efforts to the contrary, the world is in conflict with everyone and everything: countries, governments, races, colleagues, parents, friends, children, books, lessons, work. And in being in conflict with itself, it is also in conflict with God, to whom it never speaks, never says anything. The most painful loneliness is to be next to your spouse and yet unable to transmit your inner feelings, even as external messages are transmitted instantaneously from one hemisphere to another. It is painful loneliness for married couples to keep secrets from each other for years. It is painful when dialogue is non-existent between children and parents, between children and teachers, between children and clergy. There is no more cruel loneliness than for a family to sit for hours in front of the television without speaking a word among themselves. We live in a difficult time. Loneliness is at an all-time high. Man is lost. God is silent. In this loneliness, in this desolation of the cities, in this apparent absence of God, man is called to gather his thoughts, to come to his senses, to put aside his many worldly preoccupations, and to retire to his place of prayer, speechless, naked, a child, so that God may speak to him, clothe him, and endow him with spiritual maturity. Then his loneliness will become the divine loneliness of liberation, and he will achieve a sense of fullness. Only such radical loneliness leads to a fundamental understanding and experience of God, destroying every hesitation, doubt, and torment. In this sacred loneliness, man finds himself face to face with his existential poverty and the fear of death which it provokes. Yet, even here, there is the danger that he may choose procrastination as a solution and, for a time, set his panic-stricken self at ease. He may resume running back and forth endlessly, expanding his social activities and seeking a variety of entertainments, a program of extreme busyness. Other people, other things, work, and extensive involvements may serve as a cover for his spiritual impoverishment for a time. And he may continue wandering aimlessly, driven by circumstances, tormented, flirting with one thing and another, fighting, being torn, and finally annihilated. A life of work without the liberation of communion with God is slavery. The struggle for excessive wealth is an incurable, tormenting disease. Fear of the future can stimulate greed, miserliness, hoarding, and God can be easily forgotten. Here is what Abba Marcos says on how man can avoid the slavery of misguided work and instead become a free servant of God. Quote, "The one who casts off anxious cares for ephemeral things and is freed from their every need will place all his trust in God and in the eternal good things. The Lord did not forbid the necessary daily care for our physical well-being, but he indicated that man should be concerned only for each day. To limit our needs and cares to what is absolutely necessary is quite possible through prayer and self-control, but to eliminate them altogether is impossible." End quote. In the discerning remarks of Abba Marcos, which continue, let me call your attention to a subtle point which applies to many faithful. Quote, "The necessary services which we are obliged to carry out, we must of course accept and carry out, but we must let go of those other purposeless activities and prefer rather to spend our time in prayer, particularly when these activities would lead us into the greed and luxury of money and wealth. For the more one can limit, with the help of God, these worldly activities and remove the material which feeds them, the more will one be able to gather his mind from such anxious wanderings. If again someone, out of weak faith or some other weakness, cannot do this, then at least let him understand well the truth and let him try, as much as he can, to censure himself for this weakness and for still remaining in this immature condition. For it is far better to have to give an account to God for omissions rather than for error and pride." End quote. Let me repeat that last point. Quote, "It is far better to have to give an account to God for omissions rather than for error and pride." End quote. A drama is played out in man, wherein he continuously and intently seeks peace and knowledge externally. But when he comes to his senses, he realizes that true hospitality exists in an unexpected place. For it is precisely within himself that he discovers and experiences the particularity of his personhood. It is here that the divine loneliness of liberation, based on the knowledge of his individual personality, is to be found. It is here, in mystical quietude, that he measures, decides, and takes on his responsibilities. Achieving the mystical experience of what we are, what we should seek, and what we can do, involves troublesome effort, which, nevertheless, is critical. It is within us that we rescue ourselves from the loneliness of ego, and where we find the way to the light and joy of communion. Much of the world is governed by sophistry. Wisdom has been ostracized, and decency has been lost. Lies and deception abound. Revisionism has made history counterfeit. The gospel is misinterpreted. School books are political tools mouthing the ideologies of those in power. There is a tendency to mimic false Western ideologies, including sentimental pietism and painless social neo-Christianity. The life of the Church and its life-giving sacred traditions are ignored. The only refuge is for each of us to set up our own sanctuary wherever we can. To a world which considers deception to be intelligence and honor to be weakness, we must dare say, "Do not touch me." We must choose to remain voluntarily and responsibly alone, even though such aloneness requires great courage in a society which aggressively seeks our applause and urges us into amalgamation. The weariness over vanities, bitterness, constant motion, and joyless joys that has filled our lives helps us come to the realization that this is the best form of resistance to the general disorientation. By restoring our inner world, we increase our resistance and in time become invincible to the organized attacks of evil. By placing our whole life at God's feet and seeking the authentic life He wants us to live, to begin to have a foretaste of immortality, where we are never alone but in the company of Christ and His saints, all loneliness is dispelled by inner self-sufficiency. And it may help you to know that there are many out of sight who are assisting you with their prayers. These are the monastics, dedicated totally to God, who keep vigil. Even though you have not met them, they pray for you, with arms raised and with knees and knuckles calloused by their prostrations. The supreme loneliness of believers today. It has been said that each person carries his own loneliness. The mentally unbalanced individual has a dangerous loneliness. The sick person has an agonizing loneliness. One who has unjustly accumulated wealth has a bitter and ugly loneliness. But the believer carries a permanent, incurable, and supreme loneliness, the loneliness of the way to salvation. We have become accustomed to referring to the loneliness of late evening, of mourning, of living abroad, and each of us deals with our own individual circumstances as best we can. But how long will we continue to go around in circles, examining the subject externally, yet never entering its reality? Standing before the eternal enigma of existence, when will we, the sons and daughters of God by grace and participation, created in His image and likeness, the children of light, when will we dare to cast aside worldly ideas and discussions, and standing face to face before God, make the decision to fundamentally change our lives? Our movements remain uncertain. We talk about God, yet God remains someone we do not really know. We desire to be with God, we advance toward Him, yet at the last minute we find an escape route and evade Him. We love ourselves excessively, beyond measure. We are unwilling to bear God. We are afraid of Him, and we try to deceive Him, although in fact we only deceive ourselves, with excuses which appear to be convincing. We have come to love our deceptions to the point of no longer being ashamed of them. And yet God Himself never tires of seeking us out discreetly, reminding us of His presence in our sufferings and in our joys, in our mistakes and in our victories. It is necessary for believers to begin again the way of the Lord. Let us abandon the crowds and their excited shouting. Let not their words entice and influence us. The way of the Lord is narrow, uphill, demanding, lonely, but it is also salutary, as He Himself has promised us. The believer must, at last, attach himself with love to what is essential to his personal existence, setting aside decisively and irrevocably the secondary and superfluous. The message of the book of Revelation is truly awesome. The lukewarm believers will be spewed out of the mouth of God. The term used is most expressive of God's dissatisfaction with those who are indecisive and ambiguous, neither hot nor cold. To be in the company of God is both a joy to God and the greatest liberating blessedness to man. But reconciliation with God cannot be detached from reconciliation with ourselves and with our brothers and sisters. These always go together. The friend of God is a friend of himself and of others. The relationships that result have no room for conceit or isolation. Love of God must never degenerate into Pharisaism, nor love of neighbor into sterile duty. Openness in three directions, toward self, toward God and neighbor, is achieved symmetrically, with balance, with knowledge, with freedom, and with love. The great 4th century teacher of the desert, Abba Isaiah, reminds us that, quote, the pathological love of self and of others is an obstacle to our relationship with God, end quote. Cicero is quoted saying, a great city is a great loneliness. This loneliness produces boredom, a lack of appetite, pessimistic bitterness, a constant looking to the future and doing nothing today, dissatisfaction, a desire to escape, cowardice. These conditions, collectively referred to by the ascetic literature as axidia, mercilessly plague many, including the careless monastic. Here is how St. Maximus the Confessor, the great Byzantine theologian, speaks about axidia. Quote, all of the powers of the soul are enslaved by axidia, while almost all of the other passions are also and immediately aroused by it. Because of all of the passions, axidia is the most burdensome. St. John of the latter, who knows profoundly even the most subtle movements of the soul, described axidia to monks who inquired with characteristic harshness. Quote, axidia is the breakdown of the soul, the disorientation of the mind, negligence of ascetic practice, hatred of monasticism, love of worldliness, irreverence towards God, forgetfulness of prayer. End quote. Evagrios mentions that this unbearable condition of the soul devastates its victim. Quote, who does not know what to do anymore, seeing the time not passing and wondering when the meal time will come, which seems delayed. End quote. Antiochus, who lived in the 7th century, is even more vivid and precise in his definition of axidia. Quote, this condition brings you anxiety, dislike for the place where you are living, but also for your brothers and for every activity. There is even a dislike for sacred scripture, with constant yawning and sleepiness. Moreover, this condition keeps you in a state of hunger and nervousness, wondering when the next mealtime will come. And when you decide to pick up a book to read a little, you immediately put it down. You begin to scratch yourself and to look out of the windows. Again, you begin to read a little, and then you count the number of pages and look at the titles of the chapters. Finally, you give up on the book and go to sleep. And as soon as you have slept a little, you find it necessary to get up again. And all of these things you are doing just to pass the time. End quote. St. John of Damascus says that this struggle is very heavy and very difficult for monks. St. Theodore of Studion says that the passion of axidia can send you directly to the depths of Hades. Dostoevsky, who had a patristic mind, offered a solution to this problem when he had Starets Zosima tell us we must make ourselves responsible for the sins of the whole world. Quote, this understanding of our salvation through others helps us to realize that love is not exhausted only in doing good, but in making the agonies and the sufferings of others our very own. The monks pray daily for the salvation of the whole world. Created in the image of God, we are all His. We are all brothers, His children. Loneliness is abolished in God. We are all members of each other, according to St. Paul. Thus our sins and our virtues have a bearing upon the others, since, as we have said, we are all members of one body. Exidia provides a reason for more fervent prayer, and the difficulties are an opportunity for spiritual maturity and progress." End quote. Let me repeat. Separation from the world, maligned by some as desertion, is courageous and necessary, a resistance to the general leveling of all things. Man finds his authenticity, the beauty of his uniqueness, within the sacred silence of quietude, standing apart from the crowd. His suffering in solitude prepares him to return to the common and familiar, revitalized and ready for wholehearted service. Abba Alonios once said, quote, "Unless a man can bring himself to say to his heart that he alone and God are present in this place, he will never find peace and rest of soul." End quote. St. John Chrysostom said, quote, "Quietude in solitude is no small teacher of virtue." End quote. Elsewhere he also said, quote, "No matter where you are, you can set up your sanctuary. Just have pure intentions, and neither the place nor the time will be an obstacle. Even without kneeling down, striking your chest, or raising your arms to heaven, as long as your mind is fervently concentrated, you are totally composed for prayer. God is not troubled by any place. He only requires a clear and fervent mind and a soul desiring prudence." End quote. Saint Macarius of Egypt, in his spiritual homilies, becomes a little more affectionate. Quote, "Even if you find yourself poverty-stricken of spiritual gifts, just have sorrow and pain in your heart for being outside of his kingdom, and as a wounded person, shout to the Lord and ask him to make you also worthy of true life." End quote. Further on, he says, quote, "God and the angels grieve over those who are not satisfied with heavenly nourishment." End quote. Finally, Saint Macarius makes this significant and remarkable observation, quote, "Everything is quite simple and easy for those who desire to be transfigured spiritually. They need only to struggle to be a friend of God and pleasing to him, and they will receive experience and understanding of heavenly gifts, an inexpressible blessedness, and a truly great divine wealth." End quote. Being inexperienced in these more profound spiritual conditions, I should simply work in the beloved desert to uproot my passions. But there is a need to speak of men I have seen and heard, who live on the peaceful mountainsides of the sacred Athonite peninsula, who experience the mysteries of God. They are charismatic monks consumed by heaven, bearing Christ in their hearts and loving God. Devotees of quietude, of solitude, thunderous workers of silence, alone but without loneliness, who, in their solitude, remember the loneliness of the whole world, while some in the world suffer involuntarily sleeplessness, and others spend their nights without love in strange places. The monks of Mount Athos keep a voluntary vigil, praying for the health, mercy, and salvation of the whole world. An amazing book by a contemporary hermit, which circulated recently, describes the famous ascetic of Mount Athos, Hatzi Georgi, as a faithful friend of quietude in the caves of the desert, an honorable and noble fighter, a great faster who found his rest in vigils, in prayer and in solitude. The desert did not make him wild and harsh like itself. On the contrary, it refined and beautified him. His reverend biographer writes as follows, quote, "Hatzi Georgi had much innocent love for all. He was always peaceful, tolerant, and forgiving. He had a great heart, and that is why he had room for everything and everyone, just as they were. In a sense, he had been rendered incorporeal. Living the angelic life on earth, he became an angel and flew to heaven, for he held on to nothing, neither spiritual passions nor material things. He had thrown everything away, and consequently flew very high." End quote. The elder Gerasimos, the hesychast from Cantunacia, remained for 17 years, as noted by his fellow ascetic, at the peak of Prophet Elijah, struggling with demons and the elements. He remained an immovable pillar of patience. His tears were flowing constantly. He completed his carefree and quiet life in the sweetness of the constant vision of Christ. Another hesychast from Katunakia, Father Kalinikos, loved pain, toil, and quietude beyond measure. He bathed in tears and perspiration. The last 45 years of his life he passed in seclusion, praying without ceasing. His face attained the grace of shining like that of Moses when he descended from Mount Sinai. The spiritual Father Ignatius had the peculiar habit of closing the shutters of his cell so that he would not notice the coming of the new day, but could continue his prayers. It was his custom to beseech his visitors in this manner: "Love God who has loved you." He would sometimes forget to wash, to comb himself, to eat, but prayer beads were always in his hand, and prayer was always on his lips and heart. When he lost his eyesight, he became even brighter. He was fragrant in life, and he was also fragrant after falling asleep in the Lord. The remarkable priest and father confessor, Father Savas, from the little Saint Anna, drew his strength from the daily divine liturgy which he celebrated in tears. During liturgy and during his all-night vigils, he would take hours to commemorate thousands of names. This is the nature of the community of the desert: silent, praying, serene, blessed. This is the life of the desert. If a monk does not possess an intense spiritual life and a constant vigilance, he will certainly fall into a myriad of temptations. Accidia will lead him to a barren isolation when, mocked by angels and demons, he will become the worst of the worst, and the loneliness of the desert will become unbearable for him. Summing up the paradoxes. The cities become more and more desolate, and they will continue in this direction, while the deserts will become inhabited and will again blossom. No one who remains unrepentant will be able to block the repentance of the willing, the prayer of the faithful, the supplication of the poor. No one can prevent the free person from self-imprisonment, self-exile, from the living mystery of the living God. This miracle is experienced in martyrdom and in humility, where the Orthodox way of life always blossoms, in quietude, in silence, in anticipation. We are called to experience the transcendence of Christianity, which is not so much the abolishment of evil as it is the honorable acceptance of ourselves and of others, living the wealth of poverty, the health of illness, the blessing of tribulation, the power of weakness, the joy of patience, the victory of defeat, the honor of dishonor, the freedom of seclusion, the majesty of meekness, the resistance to death, the incarnation of God, the deification of man. And we should expect all these spiritual realities not from the authority of the leaders of this world, but from the authority we exercise over ourselves, and from the creation of healthy and bright spiritual hearths, which we call parish, family, cell, workshop, office, auditorium, room. In this way, though the desolation and loneliness of the cities will continue to exist, it will not penetrate into our hearts. In this way, the world can be changed, not from without, but from within and from above. Do not consider the great missionary to Africa or the significant inventor. Great is the little person who forbears the madness, the injustice, the persecution, the pain of his neighbor and of his own life. According to Abba Isaac, the person who recognizes and overcomes his passions is greater than the person who raises the dead. All who seek redemption from pathological anxiety, from sorrow and sadness, from emptiness and loneliness, are invited to a rendezvous with themselves and with God. And when you do meet, remember the humble person who has offered these thoughts.